work our way towards the end of Bernadette Meyer's remarkable poem, Midwinter Day, wanted to kind of maybe return to that sense of the tick-tock of time and how we think about beginnings and ends here in the midst of winter in Meyer's poem. As she says, as ice creeps into the house, the plain movement from relative time, and the poet writing against the passing of the light on this shortest day of the year. The poet believes in that sense of discovery in the poem. I would even discover roughly, she writes, as she kind of unwinds a catalog of physical discoveries. But against that, there's always kind of the threat of not knowing, and that kind of drives the poem throughout. I do know nothing, she writes. I don't know what anything is. I'm lost among everything, which is a green word, and I know what everything is. William Shakespeare has almost all the colors, and so does Bernadette Meyer, but I am a little bit darker. So this drive of discovery that pushes the poem, that drives the poem towards an end with the lights passing on this day, it kind of defines the energy of the poem here. Is that a disintegrating energy? Do you feel that in the rhythms of the poem? Does it feel like things are falling apart in some ways? As she writes on pages 86 and 87, it's been a mild winter, nothing to it. I have all the time in the world. I've forgotten where and who I am, like fiction, though winter's just beginning. It goes both fast and slow. My idea of it is lost, like a movie seen for the second or third time. Not the winter, everything. There's a sense of like expansiveness that's here, but that expansiveness sometimes collapses in the poem. As she says on 89, just a few pages later, we would be inside this house of not remembering. We'd wonder about this isolation. And in that shift between the poem's remembering and forgetting, between love and the threat of disintegration in the passing of light, a shadow of ice exchanges the color of light, love's figure to begin the absent night. So there's this tension that runs throughout the poem. Are things coming apart, and how is that mirrored within the mellow-poetic dimensions of the poem, the rhythms and the sounds of the language as it grows? This is a poem about waiting, the question of waiting through those periods of disintegration. As she writes on page 78, I have a sensation of waiting. You should call and tell me how the rest might go. You call and I say in some way I already know all about it. I expected it. That's a story that might happen today, but I don't dare to end, as death is still bewildering. The poet plays with a sense of end here, right? There's a sense of the physical end of death. There's the physical end of the world's disintegration. But the poet is working in a task of discovery to find some way of grasping that, to hold it at arm's length, in spite of the fact that the night is advancing on this longest night of the year. To do that, the poet needs to find a sense of place amidst the things of the physical or non-human world here. And she returns to these moments again and again in the poem. One moment in terms of the physical world, she writes on 83, it's getting dark out. What's this desire? So she has a sense of the human being is kind of twisted by forces. The human being is driven by forces, physical forces that that connect the human being to the non-human world in a way. She builds a point of comparison to the non-human world at other points. And to a light in a certain spot outside, she writes, to write like a bird migrating or returning, on page 106. That sense of connection with the rhythms and the passage of time in the non-human world that feels the passing of light just the same as the poet does here. On 113, she thinks about men working in trees and in the midst of winter, and she says, and I want to be a worker in trees as well. And that opens that great list of discoveries in the physical world on pages 114 and following. She kind of situates herself amidst those things. Is this a poem about darkness or light in the end? If as I said, that there's the sense of the passing light, there's a sense of disintegration that's present in the poem's shift from subject to subject, the poem's kind of gathering disintegration in its rhythms. Is it ultimately a poem of darkness? I know the world is straight ice, she writes. I know backwards the grief, like the progression from memory. No one knows why nothing happens. There is no reason. There's no beginning. Is the end of the poem about death, about the closing of light? She returns to the subject again and again, says that it obsesses her in some ways, that the light that's passing is felt not only in the physical world, but is felt in the poet's body, is felt within the poet's home, is felt within the language itself. She's at the end of a great series of moments where she's reading with her daughter. She writes on page 86, I sit with Marie, listening to her be against sleep, and then breathing sleep. I would have told you all those stories if you had been on my shoulder. Sometimes the story changes in remembering, like the threat of extinction, shrinking forests, quarks, quasars, and black holes, dirty snowballs and anti-rocks in space. I long for childhood to recite this introduction to love. It's so long. The sense of trying to hold these things at bay, right, in the poem, the sense of holding the darkness at bay, but she can't, right? She has to give in to it. That sense of holding death at bay. In what ways does death come into the poem? In what ways does death come into the poet? And join her in that kind of domestic world, that close world, that local world that we introduced earlier with this poem. On 102, she writes, I am ashamed that death obsesses me, but death is just the usual. The obsessiveness is something I won at poker. There's a great figure, right, of working with death in the same ways in which she worked with all of the kind of other localized stuff and the friendships and the stuff of the domestic world, the simpleness of the pasta cooking and the great subject of death, kind of work themselves equally into the poem in Meyer's understanding. So is this ultimately a poem about darkness, or is this a poem about light? Now here we might think about for a second the Meyer's work in photography, her kind of long-standing collection of photographs called Memory, which was done in 1971, and a kind of a wall of photographs that reflect on memory's places in defining the human being. And perhaps you can kind of connect to a sense of memory in the ways that she does here. As on 71, when she writes, as a child, it was always interesting to go home tired in the back seat of a car at night, then floating from memory like a person on the sea. Is it ultimately memory and waiting that defines the human being? Waiting through the dark night and trying to gather memory against it. And is that the poem's resolution? As she writes on 105, and in the end there's no end but forgetting. So does memory stay against that forgetting? Does memory stay against the approaching darkness in this world that Meyer has drawn in this long poem? At the end of the poem, she comes back to that sense of locality and closeness and familiarity and the mundane, perhaps, where she kind of refigures the dumb street light, as the light that kind of guides her in the midst of the night as she's writing, as she works towards a resolution. As she writes in the closing of the poem, that dumb street light, like the moon, shines in my one window out of 9 in the house. Then to end, I guess, with love. Now I've said this, love, it's all I can remember of Mindwinter day, the 22nd of December. Welcome, sun, at last with thy softer light that takes the bite from winter weather and weaves the random cloth of life together and drives away the long black night. Waiting and memory, are these the poem's resolution?